Last week we started our series on neighboring with a challenge. Do you remember that challenge? We had this image of these homes. Do we have that picture? And I asked you to kind of look at yourself, your own home, as the center of that square, and to think about the people who live around you, or maybe the people that you work with who are seated around you, or maybe if you go to school, those who have desks around you, and to try to just do an inventory of how much you actually knew about each one of those people who represented by each one of those blocks. And it actually turned out we had some pretty good weather, maybe to meet some neighbors this week, much better than I expected. But certainly that seems to be a continuing trend. So I hope that maybe if you didn't get a chance to do that last week, that you'll continue on this path and continue to learn a little bit more about your neighbors. I'm happy to hear that some of you took me up on this challenge. The idea of this series is to move from a place where we are thinking about loving our neighbors in the abstract to something that is much more concrete. So that when I say something about neighboring, that you should be thinking about faces and names and people. People that you're close to, people that you know well, and people maybe that you don't know so well. So that's the goal, is moving from that place where neighboring is something abstract to something that's much more concrete. This week I want to talk to you about some of the things that keep us from being good neighbors, some of the things that get in the way. So that's where we're headed this week, and we're going to talk again about the parable of the Good Samaritan. So let's take a minute now and pray together. God, for your grace which sustains us, we give you thanks. For your love which surrounds us, we give you thanks. And for your Spirit that speaks to us and reminds us of all the things that you would have us learn, we give you thanks. We pray that you send your Spirit to be with us now. Help us to know that which you would reveal to us. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. People are network devices. Do you know what a network device is? Something that, unless it's plugged into something else, it's really not worth anything. Right? People are network devices. In order to be able to really function as we should, we need to be connected with other people. But that's a challenge, because if you're not on the same network, it's hard to connect. It's hard to leap across from one network to another. Let me describe what I'm talking about. I don't know for how many of you this might be your own life, but it might be the life of someone in your neighborhood, maybe one of your next door neighbors. Think about this for a minute. So think about that home where the main way that people get in and out of the house is through the garage door, okay? So that in the morning, it's walk through the kitchen, go out by the laundry room, get in the car, garage door goes up, back out of the garage door goes down, go to work, disappear for hours, right? Come back, same thing is repeated. Garage door opens up, disappear in the house, disappear. We don't see them. Maybe they've also hired a landscaper, and so you don't really see them outside even doing yard work. Maybe, they have a dog, but they have a fence, so maybe they don't even have to walk the dog, right? So maybe if you're lucky, you get an opportunity maybe once a day when they go out to get the mail, or maybe once a week when they put the trash out at the curb, right? Those are the times where you might have the opportunity to interact with them. That's tough, right? But it's the reality for many places in America, many neighborhoods. That's how it works. As far back as the late 1930s, there was an urban planner who observed that suburbia is a collective effort to lead a private life. That's how he described it. Collective effort to lead a private life. And it's tough to connect under those circumstances. You just don't exist on each other's network, and that's a problem. And I saw this story recently that reminded me of just how much of a problem this is. So the story came out of Florida, and it was about an instance where a neighbor had called Florida's equivalent of DIFUS on another neighbor. And the reason they had called was this. The family was supposed to meet their 11-year-old child at home at a specified time, but the family was delayed. I don't know whether it was a traffic delay or exactly what the deal was. And I don't know all the circumstances surrounding it, but what happened was the young person was outside in their own yard, in the backyard, playing basketball for about 90 minutes before the parents returned. And one of the neighbors called the police to say that the child was being neglected. Now, it just struck me as a failure of neighboring all around, in the sense that this family didn't feel like there was a neighbor that they could call and say, hey, I'm late. Can you watch my kid for an hour? Right? Or even for a neighbor to be more proactive than that and to be able to say, hey, would you like to come inside and have a sandwich? Right? Why don't you come in and sit down? Let's talk about how things are going. Right? That there wasn't anybody who knew that child well enough to invite them in. We need to be networked. So what are the main barriers to that? What are the things that keep us from connecting? Well, I'd say the first one is time, right? We talked about schedules and how schedules, we have a pattern by which we live our lives, and it's hard to interrupt that pattern. Most of us feel like we can barely manage the relationships that we have, much less add to them. We have a hard time managing our family connections, managing our connections with the people that we love the most, the friends that we've got. We all think that when we enter this next phase of life, we always think that this is kind of a temporary thing, being as busy as what we are, right? When we get to this next phase of life, like when my kids are really small, I think, when my kids aren't so small and they're in school, then things will be better. And then it's kind of like, well, you know what, my kids can drive, then it will be better. And then my kids go to college, then it'll be better. And then eventually it's kind of like, when I retire, it'll be better. And I don't know that any of that's true, because I've talked to plenty of people who have gone through that transition from working to retiring, and they're like, I'm busier now than I ever was, right? We figure out ways to fill up our time. Most of us don't feel like we have the ability to invest in new relationships. I remembered this little bit that Jerry Seinfeld did, and it was at the beginning of one of his shows back in the 90s. So I found it on YouTube, and I thought I'd share it with you. Just a little funny bit about connections.
When you're in your 30s, it's very hard to make a new friend. But whatever the group is that you've got now, that's who you're going with. You're not interviewing, you're not looking at any new people, you're not interested in seeing any applications. They don't know the places, they don't know the foods, they don't know the activities. If I meet a guy in a club or a gym or something, hey, look, I'm sure you're a very nice person, you seem to have a lot of potential. We're just not hiring right now. Of course, when you're a kid, you can be friends with anybody. You remember when you were a little kid, what are the qualifications? If someone's in front of my house now, that's my friend. They're my friend. That's it. Are you grown up? No? Great, come on in! Let's jump up and down on my bed. And if you have anything in common at all, you like cherry soda, I like cherry soda, we'll be best friends!
Right? So it was easier back in the day. It was easy for us when we were kids to connect with people. We felt like we had kind of unlimited energy, for friendships. But as we get older, it's kind of like, I just don't have the time to connect with somebody new. They don't know the jokes, right? That's part of the thing. So we don't have time. But at the same time, part of my question is, what are we spending our time on then? Of course, as time goes on, and there's the Bureau of Labor Statistics does a survey, and I don't know how often they do it, but I know that they did one in 2014, where they do a sampling of about 11,000 people and ask them to do a time log. And so it's a way of determining how Americans are spending their time. And so, as you might expect, as time goes on, yes, we are working more. Interestingly, we're also sleeping a little bit more last time, 2004 versus 2014. But of course, the other thing that's creeping up, right? What do you want to guess is going up and up? TV, right? TV continues to increase. So on average, Americans spend almost 3 hours a day with TV. So 2 hours and 49 minutes or something like that, which is up about 10 minutes from the last time they did the survey. So Netflix, right? Binge watching Netflix and kind of cocooning ourselves in our homes and watching that. I mean, that's part of what's happening today. That's how we're spending our time. I guess part of the question is that really how we want to spend our time? Is that productive, right? Is it healing to our soul in any way? So if there's one challenge I think I'd want you to take away this week is maybe to think about how you're spending your time. Most of us have a pattern, right? Get up, maybe it's go to the gym, drink coffee, get ready for work, commute, spend time in the office, commute home, eat dinner, TV, and that's it. That's kind of like the day. And that's repeat over and over again, right? Where is there space for us to be a neighbor within that? Where is there space for us to create new connections with people within that? So we talked a lot about the scripture last week, about the man who fell into the hands of robbers, and about the priest who is walking by along the road, sees him but passes by. We talked about the temple servant and how he likewise saw the man on the side of the road but continued to pass by. And then we talked about the Samaritan who was willing to take the time to be inconvenienced. So the Samaritan had two key characteristics that I think are important to neighboring. The first one is flexibility. So in other words, to be able to break out of that pattern, at least for today, of coming home, eating dinner, watching TV, right? And doing something different. And the other one is interruptibility, right? I don't know how many of you see this when you're in the neighborhood. You know, somebody might be outside, but if they've got the little white earbuds in, right, forget it, right? Don't bother talking to them. They don't want to be bothered, right? It's just like code for don't bother me. All you have to do is look and you see those white earbuds, that's it, forget it, right? Don't bother. But you can't be a neighbor to someone, you can't be in a relationship of mutuality where you're supporting each other if you don't have the opportunity and you don't have the desire to, every once in a while, if I'm needed, I'm going to drop everything and I'm going to help. That's what it takes sometimes, to be able to say, yeah, I can watch your kid for an hour. It's no problem. I can do it. I'm a very achievement-oriented person, okay? So this is part of my personality, where in the morning, I like to have there are a couple things I want to focus on for the day, and I want to get them done. And so people will attest, my door is frequently closed, because it's the only way I can focus, right? My door is almost always closed. Now, it doesn't mean you can't knock on it, but it's almost always closed. Well, being a pastor and having this as a dimension of your personality is really not good. It's really not good. Because, you know what? Your job just doesn't lend itself to that. People want to talk. They pop in and they want to talk. And so there are days when I go home from the office, I'm like, I didn't get anything done today. Nothing. And then I'm really miserable because I didn't get anything done. But there's this bit of wisdom that comes from Henry Nouwen, who was a priest who actually gave up this great teaching job. And I forget where he was teaching. He taught at Notre Dame, and I think he might have taught at Harvard. He gave up his teaching job to go and work with the developmentally disabled. And that became his ministry, writing and working with people. And what he said about accomplishment and achievement was, it used to bother me that people were coming and interrupting my work until I realized that the interruptions themselves were my work, right? And when he realized that, then that opened a whole new way of seeing things. Now, I think this is true for anybody who works with people on a day-to-day basis. The same thing applies. Now, I'm still learning this, right? It's not that easy. But it's a good thing to be able to have this, to remind yourself, you know what? The interruptions are my ministry. The interruptions are my work. That's what it's about. So the question is, are we interruptible? Jesus was very interruptible. Master, can you heal my son? Master, can you heal my daughter? Can you come with me? And Jesus seemed to turn aside whenever he got that kind of a call. He was interruptible. Now, people know if you're not interruptible, right? I can put the earbuds in. I can close my door, right? People know if you're not interruptible because they get the sense that you are just pushing them out the door so that you can get back to whatever it is. If you come, don't get me wrong, if you come see me, I'm not going to do that to you. Because people know when your agenda is taking priority over their need. People have that sense when you're rushing them out the door in order to take care of something else. You cannot show people care and compassion on a schedule. It's not how it works. You can't kind of rush an interaction that's about showing someone love, right? It just doesn't work. Can't do it. Now, I know we're also afraid of being sucked in. This is one of the reasons why we don't accept those new connections. We're afraid of being sucked into something in someone's life and someone's journey that we're like, oh boy, I don't know if I can commit to that because they've got a lot going on, you know? And that's next week's sermon, actually. So you'll have to come back and think about that. That's about boundaries. But I do know that it's tough. It's tough because we don't want to be as interruptible as we need to be. We don't want to be as flexible as we need to be. But all those things are about time, and time is what's part of what's necessary in order to neighbor well. Second thing we need to do to neighbor well is we need to get past our fear. We need to get past our fear. How many of you have ever tried to strike up a conversation with a stranger and been totally shot down in the moment, right? Totally shot down. Now, we're afraid of being rejected because that's not fun, you know? And people will say, well, that's New Jersey. What do you want, you know? But I don't know. Having lived other places, I don't think it's any different anywhere. I think people are people, you know? With respect to the riches, I don't buy the Southern hospitality thing. I think people are the same everywhere. You know, some people have time for you and some people won't. And that's the way that it is. And in the neighborhood, we struggle to put ourselves out there. We're worried about how we're going to come across and how people will perceive us. And you know, we're uncertain as to whether or not once we strike up this conversation, whether we'll actually be able to follow it through, because it's kind of like, now, I'm going to introduce myself. Will I remember that person's name next time around? Maybe it's just easier if I don't even bother, you know? Here's what I've learned. You can definitely ask people at least twice what their name is. And those are free, right? The third time, the person will get annoyed with you. The fourth time, I would recommend that you find somebody else who knows them and say, what's their name again? Yeah. That's how I do it, anyway. And people think that I'm good with names. I'm not really that great with names. It's just that I'm not afraid to keep asking until I get it. And sometimes even then, I think that I've got it and I don't, and I call you by the wrong name, you know, for 6 months because you don't correct me. That happens, and has happened, and probably will continue to happen. So don't think that you're the only one who's in this boat, because everybody's in this boat. 9 times out of 10, when I introduce myself to someone and I say, you know what, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. They say, if it's not here, because here it's a little bit different, but if it's out in the community, 9 times out of 10 they say, oh yeah, what's your name again too? I'm sorry, I forgot. Everybody's in the same position. The other part of this fear of rejection is about the fear of the difference. You know, it's not so hard. We can look around at our neighbors and we can say, yeah, you know what, my neighbors are very different from me. And we can tell a whole host of things about them just kind of from their home and from their car and from, you know, the kind of activities we see them doing and from the lawn signs that they put out during election season, right? We know that they're not the same as us. They have a different background. They might have a different language. They might have a different faith. They might be different in a whole lot of ways. We don't get to choose our neighbors, right? You didn't interview them before you moved in. Maybe you should have, but you didn't. And they didn't interview you, thank God, right? So you move in, and they're like family. You're kind of stuck with them, right? You didn't choose to be there, but now you're part of that community. These are people that you didn't choose, but you can't avoid. And that makes it hard. And that's kind of the irony of the story that Jesus tells about the Good Samaritan, is that Samaritans and Jews, they were neighbors. They were neighbors who would have liked to have avoided each other if they could. So, little background about the Samaritans. So Samaria was a city. It was the capital of the kingdom of Israel, okay? So at one time, Israel was just one land under David. And then later on, time went on, the kingdom split. And now it had two kings, one who ruled from Samaria and one who ruled from Jerusalem, okay? So the northern kingdom was known as either Samaria or Israel. The southern kingdom was known as Judah. And over time, there was a lot of political rivalry between the two. And over time, there were these empires that fought over this little strip of land and tried to conquer each one of the kingdoms in turn. In about the 700s BC, the kingdom of Samaria fell to the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians, they had a very cruel but very effective way of dealing with the people that they conquered. And so what they did was they took some people from the lands that they conquered, they deported them to other places. And then they brought in people from those other places into the land that they had taken over. The idea was, we're going to plant a bunch of people and make them live together. When they don't speak the same language, they don't have the same religion, they have nothing in common, they'll distrust each other more than they distrust us, and then we'll have peace. And it was effective, right? When people don't know their neighbors, no way they can organize together. So it was effective. The people of Jerusalem and Judah and the surrounding area, they all looked at the Samaritans as people with a very sketchy ancestry. They claim to be Jews, but they have all these other kinds of people mixed in. People with different traditions. And so they said, we don't trust them, they don't trust us. The political rivalry continued up to Jesus' day. And so when people heard this story, they would have said, a Good Samaritan? Really? Is that possible? But see, here's the thing. The priest and the Levite, they passed by. It was only the Samaritan who was able to set aside even any preconceived notions that anybody might have had about him or about what he was about in order to take care of someone who was in need. He didn't care how people perceived him. He didn't care how people perceived his action. He cared only about the common humanity that he shared with this person who was lying along the side of the road. That's what he cared about. And that's what neighboring is. It's about embracing our common humanity across lines of difference, across the time constraints that separate us, across somebody's loud music that plays at whatever time of night that bothers you, right? It's about embracing our common humanity and learning to serve each other out of that. So, Jesus asked his hearers, now which one of these three was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And everybody replied, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said, go and do likewise. Amen.